Hello, it's Jeff Kraft or Kali Das again, and this is the second video in my series on common tantric myths. So today's myth is that Tantra and yoga are two different things. I will commonly hear people that even come to some of my tantric workshops or tantric meditation groups to overhear them talking to other people, and they'll say things like, I practice yoga in the morning and then I practice meditation. Or I practice yoga and then I do my Tantra. Where there's this sort of idea that there's a split. Even meditation is actually a part of yoga. And the simple truth to this is that Tantra is actually a form of yoga when it's properly understood. So yoga in and of itself, by definition, from a traditional sense, the Sanskrit word means union. That's what yoga means. And it references the deeper intention that yoga has of connecting what we have imagined our individual self to be and creating a union between that individual identity and the more universal consciousness that we could call God or spirit. That's where the union actually comes. That's the yoga. It's the yoking of our individual self into this larger experience of consciousness or God or divinity or whatever you however you want to call it. Okay? So that's what the real idea of yoga is. It is a systematic approach of self-evolving, self-awakening, self-healing that leads us from a particular state of suffering, of feeling separation, of experiencing attachments in the world, etc., and leading us into a deeper space of presence, of love, of peace, that actually evolves from within our own being, within our own heart, within our own consciousness. It's actually ultimately connecting us back to the truth of ourselves that we have forgotten about. That's what yoga is really inviting. And so yoga is that process, and Tantra actually invites the very same process. It just goes about it in a specific way. So there are two particular paths. There are lots of different forms of yoga, obviously, but there are two primary approaches to rediscovering and reconnecting with that deeper peace that is our true self, of finding that. So from a particular perspective, the yogic teachings present kind of as the highest outcome that the only thing that really exists is actually God. That we're trying to discover that, and when we're able to fully discover God, which we can also call consciousness, because it doesn't have to be any sort of religious or spiritual idea, because it ultimately just is what exists. It is the true nature of self as consciousness and awareness. And so in the process of discovering that the only thing that really exists is God, there are these two tracks, these two basic approaches. Now there's a traditional yogic approach, which we could call sort of an ascetic kind of approach. And this approach goes about the idea of saying, well, only thing that exists is God, God is pure consciousness, and therefore all of the things of the world are not God, because they are not pure consciousness. They are, in fact, illusions. This is the idea, sort of a non-dual approach. The only thing that exists is God. This whole world that we have and that we've been experiencing is all an illusion. It's, this place that causes suffering for us because we get attached. And therefore, to ease the suffering of my being, I am going to reject this illusion. I'm going to release all of my attachments. And so that becomes part of the process. Now, this is a legitimate path, although it probably doesn't appeal to you as you're listening to this. But it is a legitimate path. However, it's a very challenging path. This is the kind of path that would lead people for their spiritual practice to, abandon their family, go live in a cave, give up all their money and wander the streets begging for food, these types of things, as symbols and intentions around letting go of attachments. Now, that's one particular path. Now, Tantra is another path, or another philosophical approach would actually probably be a better term for it. So what Tantra does is it comes back to the original conclusion, and it says, well, yes, the only thing that exists is pure consciousness, or God, if you want to call it God. And if that's true, though, that means that everything that I experience in the world is also pure consciousness. It's God. So instead of going about the process of rejecting the world, it actually embraces the world as being a sacred experience, an unfolding of the divine consciousness, the divine being. So rather than rejecting it, it's how can we peer beyond the veil and experience the presence of the divine right here in this world, in our bodies, in our food, in nature around us and other people, in our desires, in our sexual experiences, in our creative endeavors, in our sense of purpose and the work that we do in the world. So how can we begin to invite our life to become the actual spiritual process? How can the experience of living be converted into a spiritual path? That's what Tantra really invites us to do. And so there are many practices that begin to connect us to deeper presence, deeper embodiment of energies, deeper embodiment of experiences, and inviting us to step beyond the limitations and the judgments that we may have for the world around us, so that we can begin to see the sacredness, to find the beauty, to find the acceptance of what is, and to be fully present and alive in the world. Tantra ultimately invites us to be as alive, as blissful, as joyful, as loving as possible, while also being as peaceful and relaxed as possible. That becomes the invitation that it has. And so it's a specific path, a specific form of yoga that ultimately leads back to that same place of there being just one God or one consciousness. It just goes about it through a different path. And what both systems will ultimately agree is that once you get to the final conclusion of really seeing and experiencing directly that everything that exists is pure consciousness and God, or that nothing that exists out here in the world is consciousness or God, that once you get to the nothingness or the all, that it all kind of melds into the same thing. If none of this is God and you find God beyond that, then you also experience the paradox of everything being God. And if you go about the approach of getting there because you're trying to weave everything into being sacred, you get there and everything becomes God, you also again experience the paradox of it not being God at the same time. You get to experience both sides of the same coin operating in truth at the same time. So that is an explanation, a rather deep explanation, on the non-dual approaches of yoga and how yoga and Tantra are really the same thing. And just as a side note, meditation is deeply, deeply connected to yoga and Tantra as well. So it's not appropriate, actually, or correct to make a distinction between yoga and meditation. They're both part of one single system. What most people think of as yoga today, when you hear the average person say, I'm doing my yoga class, what they're actually referring to is what would more correctly be yoga asana, or the postures that are connected to the hatha yoga system. So it can be helpful, I think, to make distinctions, at least in your own mind, of understanding that all of these techniques, the postures, the breathing practices, the meditation techniques, and various other kinds of approaches to yoga are all really connected to a single system, including Tantra being part of the yogic process. So that concludes the second of the myth videos around Tantra, and look for the third one soon. Namaste.